Hey folks, it's Ian, Part-Time Experience. Let's talk a little bit. So, let's talk about half casters, full casters, and how they essentially are used in combat. So, in order to best demonstrate how this is, I want you to imagine 6 lines. 2 lines that are very close to each other. I want you to label this as your front line. These are where your melee fighters are primarily going to be. Then you want your mid lines. These two are, midway away, and these two are primarily filled with ranged classes like rangers, arcane archers, or rogues who don't like being up close and personal. Things like that. Then your back line, this is where your casters primarily are. So that's what I want you to think about for the rest of this video. Front line, mid line, back line. The reason why I wanted you to break it up like that is because that actually goes into how full casters and half casters are used. Full casters should never be front line. They can be frontline, but generally they tend to not be because, well, they work better in the back line or in the mid line, mid to back, depending on the spells that they're casting. So, with that in mind, what is a full caster? A full caster is, well, wizards, sorcerers, druids, clerics, warlocks, things like that. The definition of a full caster is someone who gets up to 9th level spells and has a very large variety of spells to choose from. A half caster is someone who normally gets up only to 5th level spells and doesn't have a large variety of spells to choose from. Now, I know there's a lot of supplements out there, both official and third party, that help balance out the number of spells that each one gets with having more variety of spells from them to choose from, but it still comes down to the same that when it comes to their classes, even subclasses, their spells are primarily focused on being utilitarian and situational versus full casters, which have a much wider variety of spells to choose from to cover both utilization or utility spells, as well as damaging offense spells or defense spells. That's kind of how it goes. For instance, paladins, they are a half caster and they belong in the front line. Let's face it, they tend to be highly armored, highly mobile, and they are able to use divine smites, and that's pretty much the only thing they ever use their spell slots for. Yes, they do have access to spells, and some of which are the cleric spells, but when it comes down to it, they just don't have the same amount of oomph when it comes to their magic. They don't have the spell slots to spare that a cleric might at the same level. That's just how it is. So, because of that, paladins tend to just use their spells for divine smite and nothing else. And well, there are other smites such as Thunder Smite, Burning Smite, Branding Smite. I think there's a smite for everything, every flavor of smite. It's generally how it goes. But when it comes to paladins, they're going to be that front line using their smites, and that's what their spell slots are going to focus on. Rangers, on the other hand, are a little bit more versatile. They have a lot of spells that belong to the druid classes, so their spells come from there. However, a good thing to note is again, they are a half caster, so they don't have the variety, but they do have a lot of similarities. Their spells are primarily for situational and crowd control more than anything. Sure, they do have some healing or some ability to do one thing or another, but they're mid range, mid line. So they're going to be focusing on shooting over the front lines to hit the front lines, the mid lines, or the back lines of the other party or the other side of the engagement. So their spells need to be focused on that, who they can hit, and how they can either do the most damage in a single shot or set them up to be able to take more damage from another party member. That's kind of what rangers do. The same with arcane archers, and the same with rogues. If you think about it, if you go arcane trickster, they are considered a half caster, but at the same time, rogues are primarily there to have damage set up for them or to set up the rest of the party to do more damage. So, key thing to keep in mind. So, the ranger's half caster, it's very useful, very versatile, but again, not as effective as a full caster. So, midline. When it comes to the Artificer, who is also a half caster, think about the same as when it comes to the Ranger. Yes, they have a lot of spells from the Wizards, but again, their spells are primarily utility. They are mainly focused on situational things and essentially setting up the rest of the party to do as much damage as possible or to crowd control to essentially make the combat easier or alleviate stress on the front line. That's what their job is, and they do it pretty well. So when it comes to these full casters and half casters, again, remember the lines. You got your front lines, your mid lines, and your back lines. Front lines, remember, that's going to be like your fighters, your paladins, your rogues. Your cleric can actually be all three lines if they wanted, because just depending on how they build themselves, but barbarians tend to be also be up here. Speaking of clerics and being all three lines, because the cleric can get access to heavy armor and a shield, they can be front line, and they can be very difficult to deal with them having a high AC and a fair amount of hit points because they do have a decent hit point pool. And with them being a full caster, they can be right in the thick of it, right in the sauce of the combat, and generally do fine. So it's good that they have that compared to, say, wizards, which, while wizards do have the blade singer subclass that allows them to be front lines, they're not as effective as other subclasses or other classes in general when it comes to being front line. But hey, that's all that for this episode. Later.